Okay, so we've got two sessions this morning. Welcome to the session. The first session, risk identification and assessment, mountains versus molehills, identifying climate risks. And then we'll do this until 10 a.m. and then we'll take a break then and we'll go into the second session on risk management. So these are two different topics. Right. Risk is a huge subject area and really drives everything that we do. And I'll talk about some of that as well shortly in terms of how we think about risk every time we walk out the door. It is important to recognize that climate risks are just one of a whole variety of risks that organizations face. So you can see on the slide there, service risks, societal risk, organizational risk, security risks, asset risk. Fundamentally, the approach to identifying and managing risks for all of these different types of risks is the same or similar. But we're really going to focus on climate risks, and we'll see how we go here. In this module, we'll cover a little bit around the why of risk identification and assessment. We'll then review what terms we have heard and land on a few key definitions. I'm going to ask you for what terms you've heard about. Understanding why risk thinking is important to helping understand and adapt to climate change. We will discuss the basic process for identifying risk and then talk about how we can evaluate risks and quantify them using an understanding of likelihood and consequence. At the end, we'll get the opportunity to discuss and answer some questions and see where the discussion takes us. So, context and relationship. Juliana briefly touched on this earlier on. Risk identification is the second module in this program. Risk identification requires an understanding of and inputs from climate analysis. It also requires an understanding of what is important to each of us in our key service areas or within each of our respective departments or teams. With an understanding of the risks we face, how big they are, we have the opportunity to take action, to manage them. This is the next module. We can then use economics to determine the costs and benefits of actions and then communicate risks and actions to relevant stakeholders. So we've really got a bit of a process flow here that we anticipate people would go through all of these stages. While it may look like a linear process, like the way we have presented it here, it's not really like that at all. Communication should be considered at all stages in everything that we do. And the principles of risk management should permeate our thinking throughout. So it's pretty iterative in nature, and hopefully we approach risk management and risk thinking like that. So let's zoom out a little bit and think about what's happening in the world. So we hear these numbers around energy, food, water. We know that in terms of the global context, our planet is facing significant demands. That creates challenges for us to provide enough energy, food, or water, or other resources. And we know that climate change is only going to exacerbate these challenges. If we chunk it down a little bit more to the community level, climate change is still right in there, right up there with those other big risk and challenge areas. Aging infrastructure, growing populations, challenges for improved services, all within an affordability envelope. So this presents a very complex environment. And while there may be many bright people to help rise to these challenges, we need systematic processes and approaches to address them in a holistic manner. An effective risk assessment and management helps us with that. So the key thing there is it's about applying systematic, robust processes to help us cut through the complexity of these challenges. So the purpose of risk identification and assessment is to help us become aware of the challenges and address them, to provide us a systematic approach to managing the things that keep us awake at night. I remember one of my, when I learned about risk management, he framed it as a crocodile. It was that crocodile that was creeping up behind you and wanted to bite you on the bum. And risk management is about looking around, making sure that that crocodile isn't there to bite you on the bum. So providing, if our community is flooded out, have we reviewed the risks? Have we reviewed the flooding, the fire, the heat vulnerabilities? What if there's a wildfire near my house? What if it gets too hot in the summer? What if we don't produce enough food? Have we done our due diligence? Have we, to at least understand the size and probability of the issues and risks? And have we taken action to mitigate those risks? When we get into risk management, do we understand the status of those actions? Can we confidently say, yes, risks are being managed? And if we can answer all of those questions, then we can sit down with a degree of confidence, albeit that we're doing everything that we can, and like these people, maybe have a bit of a Zen moment. So let's break into some of the key terms. So risk is something that we all deal with in our everyday lives. Every time we cross the street or get into a car, we're making a risk-based decision. So if we're all doing it, what terms do you know to understand risk? So we're going to go into a polling question here.
So we talk about risks all the time in our day-to-day lives. So we'd like to know what some of the key terms that you know are.
So these are some of the terms that we kind of expected to come out, and I did see hazard. I didn't see threat on the list. Maybe somebody did come up with that term. Sometimes the definitions can seem a little bit complex or not that useful. What we'd like to do is just talk about some of these basic definitions, and bearing in mind that it is something that we talk about and do in our everyday lives. So there is a degree of ambiguity with some of these terms. So let's review just a few of them in a little bit more detail. So hazard or threat. So threat, hazard, might use those terms interchangeably, is a physical process or event that can harm human health, livelihoods, or natural resources. Okay. So what does that really mean? It's something that could cause something bad. So that's really what we mean by a hazard. A vulnerability. So this is the interaction with a hazard and some sort of a system. So the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. So I must admit, I start to read these definitions, and this is where I go, what are you trying to say here? So let's think about what vulnerability really is, something that could be negatively impacted by a hazard. So let's think about a hazard could be extreme rainfall, and a vulnerability could be that low-lying community. So now we've got the interaction of something physical, a community, a road, a field, a facility, and this hazard that could be impacting it. And risk, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So this is the ISO 31000 definition of risk. And again, it's another one that I think, what are you trying to say? The effect of uncertainty on objectives. And we say here, the possibility of something bad happening. So somebody's just put in the chat window there, which I think is great. It is not just something bad happening. It could be an opportunity. And we know that with climate change, there are significant upside risks. So whether you term it upside risk or opportunity, absolutely right. So appreciate that prompt in the chat window there. It's useful to think about risk and opportunity in the same terms. And that's really what the effect of uncertainty on objectives is getting at. It's not just negative effects, it could be positive effects. Okay. So another couple of terms, and these were definitely in the poll there just a moment ago. So likelihood, probability, uncertainty. So I tend to use these words relatively interchangeably, including the term chance. So the chance that something will happen. So we're really just trying to get a handle on what do we think, how can we begin to quantify or break down that uncertainty in terms of what it means. Now, I do know that there are mathematical connotations with the term probability. I've written here, I like the word likelihood because for many, probability has limited mathematical connotations. But either way, it's the chance of some event or condition. Consequence is really, I use it again interchangeably with impact, severity, exposure, the extent of, result or effect of an action or condition or event. So how big or how bad or how good is the impact going to be? So we're just trying to size it a little bit. So hopefully those terms make some sense. Now, the caveat to this is when we get into risk in a moment, one of the first stages of risk management is about understanding context and defining your risk framework. A lot of organizations will define a risk framework and they will have slightly different meanings for each one of these terms. So consequence and exposure, you might see that combined in an integrated risk management framework. So it's important to understand when somebody says exposure or when somebody says consequence, what do you mean in your framework? In very broad terms, and for the rest of this presentation, we're taking the definitions pretty much as they are on here. So what do we mean by risk? And we did touch on that just a moment ago. The effect of uncertainty on objectives. So effect is some sort of consequence, some sort of impact. Uncertainty, some sort of probability, possibility, likelihood, chance. We talked about that just a moment ago. And objectives, the things that you are trying to achieve. So they are the things that are important to you. So generally we accept that keeping people safe is something that's important. Not polluting the environment, being resilient to climate change is important to us. So those are all objectives. And a lot of organizations have their objectives stated quite specifically. So risk is really about likelihood and consequence. Whatever way round you want to express it, consequence times likelihood, impact times probability, whatever terms, it doesn't really matter. The bigger the consequence or the higher the likelihood, the higher or bigger the risk. It is common to plot it in risk space. So this is also known, this is what I like to call risk space. It's also commonly called a heat map or a risk matrix. We'll talk a little bit more around the significance of this risk space in the risk management module, because where a risk plots in here tells us something about that risk. So a couple of other key terms that some of these, I'm not sure that I saw them in the chat window, but I want to mention briefly about risk appetite and risk tolerance. So they're somewhat similar terms and similar definitions. So if you look at the people sat on the rock there, their risk appetite or risk tolerance is quite high. Number one, you won't catch me sitting on that ledge and you won't catch me walking that tightrope. So my personal level of risk appetite is much lower. So hopefully immediately you can understand that risk appetites vary from one person to the next, or from one organization to the next. So it's kind of important for us to think, my organization, what's our risk appetite? How much risk are we willing to tolerate? Residual risk, I want to throw that term in, recognizes that when we take action to mitigate risk, we can rarely get rid of it. We can rarely eliminate that risk. So we're only reducing it. And also, if we recognize that we're only reducing risks, maybe down to an acceptable level, then we may be able to save some dollars and reduce risk a little bit more cost effectively. However, we need to think about how much are we reducing risk? Are we really reducing it down into what we call a risk acceptability envelope? Or are we just reducing it just a little bit? And you know what, still the risk is still quite high. So we use this understanding of risk space, here we are in risk space, to help us understand what is acceptable or not. So you may have seen risks ranked as red, amber, and green. The inference of that is that you are defining risk acceptability or risk tolerance levels. So organizations may not realize that. If you say, right, okay, I've got a risk boundary here, you know, anything above this is not acceptable. I will not tolerate that risk. We must do something about it. Anything that's below this, in this green zip area, yeah, that's acceptable to me. I'm willing to run with that level of risk. So that's not the way a lot of people approach this risk space, but that's essentially the inference of what they're doing. So risk tolerance and risk acceptability, and the concept of how much we're reducing residual risk is key. So let's get on. What has risk got to do with climate change? So climate change related news headlines and events are occupying a greater presence in the mainstream media. Pretty much all the time now we see it. And if you're like me, I have a daily feed on climate change issues around the world. And I must admit, it does become a little bit overwhelming. And to a certain extent, it can create and induce climate stress. So this is this new phenomena about, as individuals, we're creating psychological stress around what's happening in the world. So these headlines that are here, these are taken from the last 20 years. So it's not like they've just come from the news this week. And yet the reality is any of these headlines could have come from the news this week. So it's not something new. And there was one here, David Pocock warns of devastating impact on sport if climate crisis inaction continues. So I thought this was quite funny. If things are going to start impacting us watching sport or being able to play sport, well, that's really starting to impact me. So we better do something about it. Insured losses from catastrophic events seem to be increasing. There's a lot behind this, such as the increasing of property value. Planning practices also significantly impact. If we put more infrastructure in vulnerable areas, then inevitably when those vulnerable areas are impacted, the consequential impacts are going to be more significant. However, the increasing incidence of severe weather events is a significant factor. And it's worthwhile noting that this graphic, what we're talking about here, is really just insured losses. The actual losses are significantly bigger than what we've got represented on here. But we can see some of the risks getting bigger and bigger over time, and you probably heard some of this from the Climate 101 sessions before. So risk is a big deal. So let's talk about the relationship between climate change and society, because at the end of the day, why do I care if it doesn't impact me? Uncertainty relating to the information presented is not conducive to clear messaging. Many of the climate change assumptions based on 40,000-year-old ice cores to understand how the climate is changing. These changes then need to be modeled into what are likely weather patterns that will be generated. And jumping ahead there. And then we need to understand how infrastructure and the environment will respond. And then we need to understand how that infrastructure and the environment impacts society or impacts us. And ultimately, it is all about us. As the uncertainty builds up between each one of these layers, it sometimes feels like we are crystal ball gazing. But with the improvements in science and ever more complex models, we can begin to reduce that uncertainty. And one of the things that we are doing is building up certainty in some of the trends. So reflecting that through risk management is also better than sticking our heads in the sand. So hopefully we get this sense of the relationship here between, we know that the climate change is changing, we know that climate impacts weather, and that weather impacts infrastructure and the environment. It may impact us directly, but the impact on the environment and the infrastructure ultimately impacts us. So that's some of the relationships that we're trying to model, and you can see that that's a pretty complex system to model. If we can begin to understand variability in climate patterns, the nature of weather events, infrastructure and environmental exposure, and vulnerabilities and impact on society, we can use that information to begin to systematically understand and quantify likelihoods, consequences, and risk. So we're saying here that we can use different elements here to begin to understand, provide data and information into our risk evaluation methodology. So some of those climate parameters, some of those weather return periods that you would have heard about yesterday, we can use that information to feed into a likelihood evaluation. So what's the likelihood today, tomorrow? And then when we think about infrastructure and the environment and impact on society, that's the information that we're starting to use to think about consequence or impact. What do we think the consequences will be? How severe? Do we have to repair that infrastructure? Does that infrastructure mean that we need to rehouse 5,000 people? Does it mean crop loss? And there's some sort of economic loss there. So different elements of this risk climate understanding process are helping us to understand different components of our risk equation, and we'll begin to use that later on. So let's talk about identifying some of these risks. So the risk identification process. So we're following a 4-step process here. Risk identification is essentially a brainstorming exercise. And for that, we need the right people. Now, there are approaches to risk identification, certainly in other sectors, in other industries, where they take out some of that brainstorming and it becomes much more systematic. So you might have heard of hazard assessments, or you might have heard of FMECAs that you might see in manufacturing. Those processes give you key words and key risks to think about. But generally in the climate change world, it is somewhat of a brainstorming process, and we need the right people to be involved. However, there are some things that we can do to help organize our thoughts. Number one, what is important to us? If If you don't know, I would suggest that you probably include keeping people safe and protecting the environment. So we talked about those earlier on. Maintaining sustainable communities, ensuring food production and water quality. So these things are important to us. So these are the objectives that we talked about before. Number 2, hazards. Make a list of the climate hazards in your area: drought, flood, fire, wind, tornado. Make a list of your key assets or services: fields, forests, watersheds, aquifers, rivers, buildings, whatever it happens to be. Review how the hazards could impact the assets or services. Are they vulnerable? And record the results, evaluate the relationship, communicate to people to get their input. So we're essentially following this 4-step process here. What hazards do we face? What systems are sensitive to those hazards? What control measures do we have in place? Are they effective, and who needs to know? So very interested to know your views on incorporating stakeholders and the public from the earliest opportunity in developing risk management planning and even identifying the scope and range of risks. So this is a good point. We've said it's somewhat of a people process. People do come to the table with their biases, and I think we need to acknowledge that and recognize that. So whether that be internal stakeholders or whether it be external stakeholders. I think also thinking about that engagement process, if we were to go to the public without having thought about risks in the first place, you can anticipate anything that you do with the public ultimately is going to end up being fairly political in nature. If you go to the public without thinking about risks first and sounding somewhat intelligent, I might be concerned that they would go, "What, you haven't thought about this? Why haven't you thought about this before? You don't know what you're doing there." So I might be a little bit more conservative in, rather than approaching the public for engagement first, doing some internal engagement with what you could argue is a relatively safe crowd. However, at the same time, there is a huge amount that we can learn from the public. We do need to acknowledge that stakeholders, they have particular personal insight, especially on consequences that we may not appreciate, or some of the hazards, some of the interactions, some of the vulnerabilities that they may say, well, what about my fields, my crop? What about my greenhouses? What about my property or my business? And that might then elicit some sort of vulnerability and what that might mean for supply chains or for some other industry area. So it is crucial that we do engage with a broad audience, and either the public or public representation. But we do need to go into this whole process open-minded enough to engage a variety of people. And risk management, the linkage between risk management and resilience, absolutely, these things are back-to-back connected. If we are managing risks down to an acceptable level, and we are putting into place the risk management actions, we are building up more resilient communities, more resilient organizations. So we will touch on that a little bit in the second session here. I'm going to press on. We mentioned before that some of the key terms, let's add some more and put them in context. Risk is at the heart of what we're seeking to understand, but to really understand that risk, we should understand the causes. These will all help us build a picture of likelihood of a risk occurring. And because of those causes and the particular vulnerability that we're looking at, there could be some consequences. So we talked about the cause and the consequence. We talked about the cause and the likelihood, and we're talking about some of the consequences. The consequences, the causes of consequences associated with risk may be many and vary, so it's not just a one-to-one relationship. If you think about a simple risk like a trip or a fall, there must have been some hazard, let's say ice on the sidewalk. And potentially, you can't say that the ice on the sidewalk caused the trip or the fall, it was a hazard. You may have been wearing inappropriate footwear, or perhaps you were in a hurry and not looking where you were going. So you can see that there's a variety of different factors that are going into some sort of risk event. And when we think about climate change, it's no different. Climate change risks are not simple. They are caused by a variety of factors, and they may lead to a variety of consequences. So we need to be aware of that complexity. And when we describe risk, break it down into some of these key elements: cause, asset or service impacted, risk description and consequence. These are some of the things that you would find useful to describe. You may have noticed, excuse me, that this picture here looks a little bit like a bow tie. And you may have heard of the bow tie approach to risk assessment. So fundamentally, this is the bow tie approach to risk assessment. What are some of the causes? What's the risk that you're describing? What are some of the consequences? Okay. We'll carry on. Risk identification. So we've touched on this already. Quick reminder, very much a brainstorming exercise. Get the right people involved. Use the tools and the prompts to help, but don't be constrained by them. If there are other things that come into play that maybe aren't on the table, add them in. Build up the information about causes, consequences, be as specific as you can. Who would be affected? Where would they be affected? When would they be affected? Try and be specific about what we're describing. So this is that matrix of relating potential hazards along the top here with potential vulnerabilities, and where we have a tick, we have an actual vulnerability that we would take forward. And so this is the classic approach to undertaking a PIVC assessment. So assessing and evaluating risks, we're getting through here. Okay, let's go. The basic formula looks like a math equation. So I quite like the math equations. It lends itself to quantifying things with numbers. So we've got this basic formula of consequence times likelihood. For likelihood, we need some form of scale from something that is not very likely, e.g. rare, to something that is very likely or very frequent. The table on the top right shows how it is commonly expressed. But what does this really mean? We use these terms, but two people may interpret these terms very differently. We need a less ambiguous approach to understand likelihood. How often will it happen, or how soon could this risk happen? We can then convert this into some form of annualized likelihood. Of course, it's not precise. We are predicting the future, but we are at least on the same page about interpretation and can have a conversation about it. Okay. There are a lot of factors that go into understanding likelihood. The climate scientists can provide an indication of event return periods. So there's some of the people that you might want to engage in your risk assessment process. With robust downscaling, we can somewhat get them to take into consideration local conditions. We can look at historical occurrences. Are they getting more frequent? So typically on facilities, you can ask operators, or you can ask more operational staff, those people that have been in an organization for most of their career. Ask them, what's your perception, and there's that word perception, on how how frequent events are. We also need to consider how resilient our systems are already, i.e. what controls, what systems do we have in place to mitigate some of these risks. And the resilience of our systems could be a function of a whole raft of different considerations. Do we have spares? Do we have how have we configured our systems? Do we have side-by-side systems where if one is out, you can now begin to run the whole process of another system. So it could be in a water plant, you could have a level of redundancy. That's the word I'm trying to think of in a water plant. While we talk about all of these different data inputs, often it boils down to a judgment call on likelihood. And if you have the right people involved in that likelihood assessment, it's okay. So I know that there's some chat in the window here. We're going to pick some of these comments up in the Q&A session, which we'll get to here shortly. So consequences. When we think about consequences, again, it's a brainstorming activity. If this event happens, what will be the impacts? That's the kind of questioning approach that we're taking. Will people get hurt? Will services be impacted? Will there be other losses? How many people will be impacted? What are the areas? What areas will be impacted? How long will they be impacted for? Are they vulnerable communities or are they critical resources? So with this big information, we can begin to think about quantifying the consequences. And again, you get that information by asking people. If the data exists, great, bring that data into play. But quite often that data is held in people's heads and we need to elicit some of that data out. When we think about consequences, we need to think about consequences in a variety of different dimensions. So not just safety consequences. What about service loss? What about economic losses to the community? What about social loss? What about that personal stress? What is the impact on that? What about environmental losses? And what does that mean for the future? So there's a variety of different dimensions there that we need to think about when we're thinking about consequence. Again, it's not a simple evaluation. Like the likelihood evaluation, it is common to use a simple table like this, and we can translate the words severe, major, moderate, etc. into numbers and do that all important math. So we're trying to get to these so that we can do that math equation that we talked about earlier on. But these numbers, again, are very ambiguous. Remember that we have different risk appetites, and we perceive risks differently. So if my son lost his piggy bank with $67.36, he would be really upset. That's a big deal to him. As an individual, a loss of several $1,000s might be a big deal. But actually for an organization, both of those would be insignificant risks, insignificant consequences. So we need to think about the risk consequences in line with the organization and begin to quantify what it really means. We need a way of saying what major or severe really means so that we can be on the same page with one another, so that we can communicate with each other. So enter the consequence equivalence matrix. So this helps us to compare the severity of different types of events and scale them. So we can use this later when we begin to consider the impact of climate change. The matrix is unique to you or your organization or your department. It needs to be appropriate to the nature and extent of the risks that you are going to assess with it. So fundamentally, what we're doing here is we're saying, if I have a major injury, that's a moderate risk. If I have a month's worth of loss of maybe a non-critical service, that's a high risk. If I lose $50,000, that's a low risk. So we're beginning to translate what do some of these low, medium, and high really mean in terms of consequences. What is even better is if we think about consequence events and break them down. If we do that, we can begin to put a dollar value to them. And this provides a totally continuous scale for understanding consequences. In terms, expressed in a way that we can all get our heads around it. And we can do that because we deal with money every day. So immediately, if I were to say, we've got $100,000 risk and we've got $150,000 risk, immediately you know what's the bigger risk. And you know that one is 50% times 50% bigger than the other risk. So we deal with money every day. It lends itself also to making decisions. So if we have $1 million risk, then I'm clear that spending $500,000 to mitigate that risk is a good deal. If I have $1 million risk, but spending $10 million to mitigate that risk, hey, that seems pretty expensive. So I'm beginning to make a judgment call. Because I'm expressing risk in dollar terms, I can begin to make a judgment call about, well, what's it worth to evaluate that risk? Is it costing us more as society to mitigate the risk than it is to accept that risk? Whereas if I've got 10 points of risk and I'm spending $1 million, I have no sense of what that means. I don't know, is that a good deal or is that not a good deal? So that's why I like to express risk in dollar terms. So breaking down a risk into dollar terms, we can begin to think about how do we do that? Well, let's think about how we might respond to that risk. What business loss might be incurred? What evacuation and rehousing might be required? What damage and recovery could be incurred? What environmental losses, what public health issues could be arising associated with these risks? So if you kind of think, well, we can't do that, the insurance industry does this. A lot of industries do this. So here's a case study about flooding. If this is the estimated impact today, over time, that impact will increase. So let's just walk through this very simply. We've got the sense of flooding, and we kind of go, well, what happens if we have some sort of a flooding event? Well, we know that there could be some property damage, $400 million worth. We know that there could be some business loss, $300 million worth. We know that there could be some event management, $2 million worth of event management, traffic and other economic loss, productivity losses, $10 million. There could be some health and safety issues, $3 million. So we can begin to add all of this up into an overall estimated level of impact, $750 million. If we begin to look at, well, okay, what's the likelihood of that losing that $750 million? Well, let's say the likelihood is 1 in 100 years. We can translate that into a number and begin to calculate some math doing multiplication here. So we've got 715 multiplied by 0.01. So we got about an annualized risk of $7 million. If we look, that event that might happen once in 100 years, we know that with climate change, that event is going to become much more frequent, could happen once in 20 years. So we can begin to increase our probability. We've actually assumed here an increase in the impact as well. And we can see that the risk now has gone up from 7 million to 75 million. So now I'm starting to think about what is the increased risk associated with climate change. So I can see some conversation in the chat here. We'll come into this in the discussion in terms of quantifying some of those less tangible aspects of risk. We'll come back to it. So we can plot those risks in risk space, see immediately that today's risk is not great. Definitely on the watch list. You may think you need to do something about it today, depending upon what your risk tolerance is. Or you may just kind of think, right, this is on our watch list, but actually that future climate change risk, that's now pushed it into the red zone. We definitely need to do something about it and build some resilience into what we're doing. So a couple of examples here. Now we're into that sort of adaptation piece. Calgary, for example, has developed an adaptation strategy as part of their climate resilience strategy, quantified some of the risks and identified adaptation actions associated with what are perceived to be some of the higher risks. Again, we see other organizations doing this. So Edmonton, very similar kind of process, understand what some of the vulnerabilities, assess the risks, and then begin to put adaptation actions in place. So the key takeaways: climate risk is one of many different types of risk. And when accountants and investment planners are looking at how much investment an organization needs, they're probably taking into consideration all of those other risks. So it's important that we can articulate climate risks in somewhat similar terms to other types of risks that an organization could be facing. There are key terms that are often used ambiguously, so don't assume that everyone understands your terms. Recognize that we all have a different tolerance for risk. When we describe risk, we should consider causes, likelihood, and consequences. Risk identification is essentially a brainstorming process. We need to get the right brains involved to help us. This isn't to say that we don't need data and information. Use data and information as much as you can. Without data and information, you're just another person with an opinion, but at least let's get some clever people with some bang on opinions into the room. Quantifying risk in dollar terms helps us to evaluate and make risk decisions. Right, so this is the follow-on session, and this might begin to answer or build on the answers to some of those previous questions. So these things do go together, and we can't think about risk identification. What's the point if we're not going to do something about it and take action? So that's really what we're getting into here. So build on the previous session. We will discuss the broader picture around the process of managing risk. So the principles, we'll touch on the principles. They're important to keep in mind as you manage risks. This will touch on the process, the standard risk management process drawn from ISO 31000, which is the international standard on risk management. And then the remaining sections will cover the process of identifying risk mitigation actions and deciding the best course of action and the requirement for monitoring risk over time. So those are those topics there, 3, 4, and 5. So risk management, third module in this program. Risk identification is part of the broader process of managing risk. So I would say it's almost like a subcomponent of risk management. But risk management is about that taking action. Actions need to be evaluated. This is a key focus of the economics module. Risk management is also an exercise in communicating with others, which we really touched on in that previous module there. Risk management actions also impact the way we do things in our respective service areas. So definitely a a significant interaction here between what we're talking about and all the other areas, all the other topics. So risk management, said this time and time again, it is about taking action. Without action, we cannot really say we are managing anything. Actions may be about capital adaptation actions, or they could be about changes in operational practices, or they could be about change management actions. So they could be about changing business processes, or they could be about communicating with people. All of those could be considered as taking action. Hopefully it's action that's targeted at managing or reducing risk. So this slide is a little bit busy. I did want to touch on it. It is the principles of risk management. So these are drawn straight from ISO 31000, which we'll touch on in a moment. So let's just go through the principles. So integrated. This means that when we do our risk evaluation, it's an integrated part of organizational activities. If we're kind of doing risk over on the side here and it's not going anywhere, it's not going to be effective. If we're doing risk evaluation on the side here and people from your organization aren't involved, they're not going to buy into it. If we're not considering some of the other pressures and priorities and objectives of the organization, it's not going to work. So risk management does need to be integrated into you as an organization, into your business processes. It needs to be talked about in management meetings, and it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. Structured and comprehensive. So if we sit around the table and go, oh, I think the biggest risk is this, that, or the other, while I said it is a brainstorming activity, if we don't add structure to it, we're just going to be pulling in lots of bias. So we need structured, comprehensive approaches that make us think about, well, what are all the risks that we should be considering? Drought, flood, fire, hail, all of those other risks. And structured, are we considering and evaluating each of those risks in a systematic manner? Are we doing that likelihood times consequence evaluation? Are we using that consequence matrix, consequence equivalence matrix that we talked about? Have they got likelihood expressed in similar terms? Again, if you've got if you've got a risk that's 10 points and a risk that's 150 points, but 150 point risk is evaluated in a completely different way, then it's kind of meaningless. Customized, is it applicable and relevant and suitable for your organization? We talked about scaling those consequence parameters. Is it customized to your organization and your context? Is it inclusive? Does it include timely involvement of stakeholders, whether they be internal stakeholders, external stakeholders? They have a role to play. Is it dynamic? Risks are rarely static. We know that with climate change, risks are going to change. But even as we do things, as we build new roads, as we build new communities, as we create social structures, risks change. And we need to understand that changing risk. And whether it means just updating our risk assessment, we need to acknowledge that risk changes. Best available information, so that's that. Let's use data and evidence where possible. Let's use that scientific data and evidence where possible. But recognize that some data and evidence isn't necessarily just founded in storm return periods or those kind of assessments. It may need to be bolstered with, well, what have we actually experienced over the last few years here? What do our professionals and experts say? Let's begin to bring in some of that tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is that sort of unorganized knowledge and information that we can bring into our risk assessment and risk management processes. Let's take into consideration human and cultural factors. So we talked earlier on about how people evaluate cultural impacts differently. We need to take that into consideration. Let's understand how maybe certain sectors of society, we think they're able to respond to risks, but perhaps they can't. Perhaps there could be a whole variety of reasons why certain sectors of society are more vulnerable or less vulnerable, or why the impact is bigger for them, whatever it happens to be, or why they may or may not be able to get involved in mitigating risks. And then continual improvement. We describe that process as a linear process, not a linear process at all. We need to be going round in circles, not going round in circles, spinning our wheels, but going round in circles in an iterative manner, improving what we do. So let's do the risk assessment now. Let's come back and review it in a year's time or 2 years' time. And can we do it any better? Do we have better information? Do we better understand stakeholders that we can get involved? So these are key principles here. There's a lot to think about, but hopefully it resonates with some of you here, and we can fold it into our thinking. So let's think about what that risk management process is. And we're going to bear this, draw this straight from ISO 31000. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail, but fundamentally it's this. We live in a particular environment, and we have some sort of broad understanding around what some of the issues are, what some of the environmental factors are. So here we are in the prairies, warm, humid, fire, drought, flood, tornado. We're not having a conversation around sea level rise. Let's put it that way. So we're thinking about what our context is. Let's look around us, see what we can see. So identify risks. Let's begin to analyze them. Some sort of mathematical calculation, some sort of likelihood, consequence, cause. Those are some of the things that we're thinking about during the analysis. The evaluation then is, what are we going to do about it? Can we stand here and ride it out? Do we need to run? Do we need to do something different? And then treatment is taking action. So in very broad terms, that's what risk management is about. ISO 31000 adds a little bit more complexity and doesn't present it in quite such a graphical format, but fundamentally it's the same thing. ISO 31000, if you didn't catch it before, this is the international standard for risk management. So you may have heard things like quality management systems, environmental management systems, asset management systems, whatever they are. They all draw on ISO 31000 when it comes to risk management. And my understanding that this is actually being reviewed at the moment. It's designed to be suitable for different industries. And because of that, I know some people go, it's not specific enough for me or my industry. It's not a certification standard. So this isn't like 9001, you get the badge on the wall. It's a guidance standard. It's widely adopted by numerous organizations as the base framework for risk management around the world. And we're going to step through each one of these stages in the next few slides here. So step one, see the little graphic at the top here, this is where we're at. Scope, context, and criteria. A lot of content on this slide, but it's just really about understanding who you are and where you are. So you could be a community that is built in a floodplain. That's pretty important context to understand. Is there a public profile to the things that you do? What is your key product or service? Are you in a tornado belt, a wildfire area, an agriculturally sensitive area? Some risk assessments are just about climate change risks. Other organizations might adapt an all hazards approach, such as you might have heard of Envision credit rating systems. So what is the scope of your risk assessment? So these are some of the considerations that need to be considered in this step one. Also in here would be, how are we going to go about evaluating risks? So it's your risk management framework. Who are we going to tell? Who are we going to communicate to? How are we going to escalate risks? So all of that is sort of set up in this stage one here. Once you understand your context, criteria, and approach to risk management, you can begin to identify risks, identify hazards, vulnerabilities, and determine risks. Note that hazard is not the risk itself. Risk is the articulation of likelihood and consequence. In the chart here, we're plotting a range of risks associated with different hazards. And in this example, it wasn't just climate risks. It was an all hazards approach, and you can see it's for a water system in BC. Evaluate likelihoods or consequences and impacts. Understand, how does this fit within your risk tolerance threshold? Understand cause, analyze cause. What existing controls do you have in place? So this would all come under this step 2 risk assessment. Treat risks. If it's a risk that you want to do something about, then take action. So in order to take action, have I jumped ahead one here? Risk assessment. Yeah, risk assessment is a 3-pronged process. My apologies there. Treat risks is once we understand and we've determined what action to take, we need to carry out that action. If it's a risk that you want to do something about, then do something. Evaluate actions. Are they practical? Do they adequately address the risk? Do you already have actions in place? Do those actions work? So this starting to link to monitoring, whether and recording and reviewing whether actions have even taken place. Assess the effectiveness of treatments. Confirm if the residual risk is acceptable, and if not, potentially take further action. So that's that continuous iterative nature of what we're doing here. Monitor, review, and communicate. So this encourages organizations to review and improve the approach to risk management and keep a watch out for new and changing risks. So it's not just about saying that action that we identified, yes, we've implemented that action, or no, we didn't get the funding for it, it's still a risk. It's also about taking a step back and saying, hey, we get together as a committee once every 5 years. Is that often enough for us to manage our risks? Probably not. Maybe we should get together as a risk committee every year or every quarter. Is our evaluation of likelihood and consequence effective? Are we getting the right people involved? So you're taking a step back and reviewing your overall risk management system. Also monitoring whether risks are changing. That risk that we identified last year, we've just gone through a quick assessment now and it seems to be a lot bigger. Maybe we ought to do something about that. So that's risk monitoring, reviewing, and communicating risks. Communicating, who do we need to tell? Who can help us? It's like a communication and consultation piece combined. Do you need to update your climate change projections? I know there was a comment in the previous chat window there around, we say that some weather event is going to have a 1 in 100-year return period. And funnily enough, we've had 2 of those events in the last 5 years. So there is an element of statistics there, but maybe that 1 in 100 is no longer a reliable statistic. Maybe we need to update our climate change projections or our weather return period projections or our design guidelines. Capture and report the risk. Capture and report the risk information that you learn. So this could be on a risk register or some other recording system, or it could be something a little bit more visually appealing. So the information will be dependent on who the audience is. Again, when we think about reporting information, we need to think about who are we communicating that information to. So risk registers, we'll touch on risk registers a little bit later on. That is a useful tool to capture risk information, just document risk treatments and confirm whether they're actually effective, provide information for decision making. So we know that so-and-so is developing the capital program. I've just done this risk analysis. I need to tell them, I need to get stuff into that capital program. So that's communicating and reporting through the organization. How often do you need to record and report that information? And how are you going to report it? Are you going to post it up there to the public on a web page or to your organization on a web page? Or are you going to do public engagement and report it a little bit more actively? So where does risk management sit within an organization? Realistically, it's throughout an organization. There may be tactical risk registers that have a small number of departmentally significant risks that you want to tell somebody about. Of these departmentally significant risks, there may be a small number of the most significant ones that you need to tell the boss about. And these are usually managed by some form of risk committee, if it's corporately significant. So information at all levels should really be used to drive action. Capital maintenance, operational actions, policy actions, standards, or even change management programs. So we can see here that we're using risk information to drive different actions. That changes the risk landscape. These activities change the risk landscape, and so the process is somewhat circular. There are obviously, think about how you're going to visualize and report that information, how you're going to report it to your boss, how you're going to report it upwards or to other stakeholders. Recognize that there's a whole variety of risks. As you complete work, those risks will change. So keep reviewing the risks regularly. In my organization, our departmental risk management committee, which was essentially the management team, we would meet on a quarterly basis and report to our corporate risk committee. And then the corporate risk committee is also thinking about fraud and financial risks and things like that within the organization. So we're coming up to the poll here.
But so we're wondering, so Owen's talked a lot about risk management, and we're kind of wondering if all of these things are new to you. Do you perform risk management in your everyday work? It doesn't have to be related to climate change. We're just kind of trying to get an idea of where everyone's at in terms of the familiarity of the information that Owen's been presenting.
We looked at risk identification and assessment in the previous model. Let's look at doing something about them. There are several different things that we can do about risk. Generally, these are often consolidated into these 4 key terms, but obviously, you can come up with what are some of the other things that we can do. They might fall into one of these buckets. So we can avoid risks and mitigate them. We can reduce risks. We can share or transfer risks. So if you think about insuring or outsourcing, you're really putting that liability out to somebody else. Or we can accept a risk. And even when you accept a risk, you might want to put some action in place, like a contingency plan, so that if a certain event were to arise, you could react to it. So an adaptation plan, if we think about this in terms of adaptation planning terms, it might need to cover actions in all of these areas. So an adaptation plan isn't just about building stuff or avoiding and reducing risks. An adaptation plan will need to think about actions in all areas. So the images here show two very different strategies. On the left, they're managing the risk as it arises. And on the right, they've spent a lot of dollars to reduce the risk by building a wall. So two different, very different approaches here to managing risk or treating risks. The word treating risks, I know it doesn't quite resonate with me, but it is the commonly accepted term that's out there. So I just want to prompt some more thoughts to how we consider risks. So there are different types of solutions that we can apply. The risk could be tripping up on a loose tile. You know, what are you going to do? Are you going to put up a sign saying, watch your step? Or are you going to fix the tile? If you think about a potential fire risk for a facility, what could you do to mitigate the consequence? What could you do to mitigate, to take some sort of you may need to take some sort of corrective actions. What are you going to do to mitigate the problem? Corrective solutions would really be if you had a fire in a facility and you wanted to, you might need to actually repair that facility, and repair the damage caused by the fire. So that would be really, excuse me, that would really be the corrective solution. Quite often only tackling the problem. If we think about the problem, it could be also installing sprinklers. If we think about cause, then we may need to think about preventive solutions. So let's prevent the building from burning in the first place, create a fire break or fire smart actions. So really addressing the root cause, excuse me. Generally, the further back we go, quite often the more expensive solutions could be, or the more effective they can be. But you can also understand here that actually this is why we need to understand what the cause of a risk is. We don't want to just tackle the risk itself or the consequences. We need to think about what some of the causes are and really begin to tackle them. Otherwise, you're not tackling the root causes, and you may be spending money here time and time again. So another way of thinking about different risk options is, well, where does that risk land in risk space? So things that are in the red zone, yeah, for sure, we want to avoid those. We probably want to do something about it. Things that are in the green zone, that's another easy one. We can accept those risks. Things that are down in the bottom right-hand corner here, and notice I've got likelihood up the side and consequence along the top or along the horizontal. Things that are in the bottom right-hand corner, these are the rare events. So you might not want to build something right now, but you might want to put in some emergency procedures or planning procedures, or you might want to think about some insurance protocols for some of these unlikely but high consequence type events. And then on the opposite side, when we're thinking about those things that are relatively low consequence, but actually they're risks that occur frequently, they might be just things that you're not geared up to deal with effectively. So, if you think about safety risks, if you're deploying people out on a regular basis to go and deal with a certain situation, do you have an appropriate business process? So you think about, I don't know, firefighters that are fighting forest fires. Do you have appropriate training, business protocols in there? You know that this is going to come up several times a year, every year. So it's going to come up frequently. I wouldn't necessarily say that was an insignificant risk, putting firefighters into a forest fire, but it is certainly something that comes up frequently. So do something about it. And they may be business process solutions, or it may be that you say, look, our team just aren't geared up for this. We need to hire some professionals. We need to outsource this activity to another organization that is better able to manage risk. So you can see that depending upon where the risk sits in risk space, it can also help us to think about what type of solutions we can employ. So another way of thinking about different types of solutions, when we think about the array of different options, I find this helps me to think about alternatives. So there are always alternative approaches to dealing with risks. There are those big engineering works that are often good at mitigating or even eliminating risks. I did say that we never eliminate risks, but to all intents and purposes, let's assume that some risks can be eliminated. However, those big engineering solutions do cost a lot of money. At the other end of the spectrum, there are those more operationally orientated options that don't cost much, but they might only reduce the risk a little bit. So this is our part of the challenge around determining risk management options. Do we go for the big dollar stuff with a very low residual risk? So there could be an affordability challenge there. Or do we go for the low dollar stuff? We can do this today, tomorrow, but there could be a higher residual risk. So it's not a straightforward conversation. So we're going to take a quick look at the case study here. If you have a pond that ices up over the winter, with climate change, that ice could not be thick enough to go on. So what could you do at the cheap end of the spectrum? And what could you do at the more expensive end of the spectrum? So I'm going to ask you just to put some comments in the chat window here. Give us some ideas about what you could do at A, and then B, give us some eliminate type options. So we're not going to do this on Menti or on another platform. Just put some ideas in the chat there. Just go A, I think we could do this. B, could do that. And C, we'll just see what we come up with. We just want to make sure you're still watching. So A, sign it, great one. Remove the pond, perfect, absolutely. Or fill the pond in. Fencing, stop skating. So this is exactly it. This is what we wanted to prompt you to do. Alternative use of the pond. So you might be creating a benefit or a new risk. Close the pond. A lot of closing the pond people here.
I like Jenna's comment to build the new rink for an eliminate type. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the conversations that we have in when we're thinking about risk treatment options. Could be put a sign up. It could be close the pond. This is just not safe enough to do. And if you really want to stop people going on there, fill the pond in, which has probably created all sorts of other stuff. There you go. I like that one. Build a massive solar farm to power a huge refrigeration unit to freeze the lake. I like it. Okay, so some good ideas there. Appreciate your input. We're coming up with a spectrum of options. You can see that they have different cost profiles. They have different residual risk profiles. Oh, how did that one happen? Q&A. Evaluating treatment options and making decisions. So I think we're in the home straight here. I like this caveat, this comment here. One day Alice came to a fork in the road and saw a Cheshire cat in the tree. So if you don't know, this is from Alice in Wonderland, written by Lewis Carroll. Which road do I take? Said Alice to the Cheshire cat. Where do you want to go? Said the Cheshire cat. I don't know, Alice answered. Then the cat, it doesn't matter. So the same thing, when we're doing decision making, if we evaluate treatment options, and number one, we don't know what's important to us, then it doesn't really matter what treatment option we pick. If we're evaluating treatment options and they're all coming out broadly even, then probably doesn't matter what we pick. So I guess the key takeaway here is we need to understand what's important to us. We might need to dig a little bit more deeply around, well, what are some of the factors that we need to consider? And that could be policy objectives, it could be safety, environmental objectives, social objectives. There could be a whole raft of parameters there of things that may or may not be important to us as individuals. We need that information so that we can begin to make decisions. So some fundamentals to think about to support decision making. Baseline risk. Is this a risk that you want to do something about? If the baseline risk is unacceptable, then yes. If the baseline risk is acceptable, then no, we don't want to do anything about it. Let's just leave it. Residual risk. If we reduce this risk, is it acceptable? Yes or no? Is it if it's not acceptable, maybe it wasn't the right solution. Maybe we need to think about a different solution. Is it affordable? Can we afford to do this solution? What's the cost benefit? Does it feel like good value for money? Does it align with our corporate goals? So in very broad terms, these would be some key decision-making criteria. But you can see that cost-benefit evaluation, where we evaluate all of the risks and the cost to mitigate those risks, it's not the be-all and everything. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's just a component part of that decision-making process. So we are going to jump into that cost-benefit piece a little bit more, and you might cover this in the economics module if you're signed up to this a little bit more as well. So I like this. I talked before around expressing things in dollar terms. It's only one approach to decision making. Personally, I think it's great. It can be applied in many different scenarios from super high level. So, I want to replace the fence in my back garden. Do I think this is a good thing to do? We want to implement this strategy through the organization. Do we think this is a good thing to do? And have a 5-minute conversation about it. Or you can drive it down to a full-blown cost-benefit analysis that takes a month to complete. Either way, this cost-benefit process kind of holds up. You can do it at optioneering stage. You can do it at investment prioritization stage. You can do it, at a sort of brainstorming stage. It doesn't really matter. You can do it at any time. You definitely need to engage others. And then you need to take a step back and look at what's driving the decision. So I'm just going to unpack this formula. Again, it's very mathematical. I'm just going to unpack this formula a little bit. What's really going on here? So a cost benefit assessment, there's lots of ways of doing cost benefit. You could do benefit cost, you could do benefit minus cost, cost minus benefits. It doesn't really matter. Fundamentally, they're all broadly the same thing. In this case, we're doing costs divided by benefits, so we're generating a ratio. On the cost side of the equation, obviously, there might be some capital costs or one-off costs. There might be some operational costs, which are those things that happen year after year down the line. So if we build that big solar farm over that pond, are we committing ourselves to some sort of operational expenditure year on year? Are we committing ourselves to renewal dollars that we need to spend on that system after 15 years, 20 years, 40 years? What are the social, economic, environmental costs of delivering that? And then on the benefit side, how are we reducing risks? So if we understand the current risk or lost opportunities, how are we reducing risks or realizing those lost opportunities in the future? And again, we need that economic, social, and environmental consideration there. And I talked before around expressing everything in dollar terms. If I express this in dollar terms, then I can begin to understand, is this good value for money? So in very simple terms, this is the cost-benefit approach that I like for decision-making. You can use it simply, or you can use it in a very complex approach. So here's an example. We've got a grain facility. It's a facility that's exposed to risk of flooding. So let's assume that the risk is annualized for $300,000. So I've done my risk analysis. I've worked out what the risks are. I've calculated the likelihood and probabilities. I've come up with an annualized risk of $300,000. Simplistically, it's subject to flooding. What could we do? We could raise the building. It's going to be quite expensive to do that. We need to elevate the foundations. We need to elevate the steps, the floor, the everything else. It's going to cost $1 million. Fairly expensive. Or perhaps we could put some floodgates where the water is most likely to come in. So maybe part of the facility will be below the projected flood level, but actually it's only going to cost $100,000. So this, go on to a table here. This table just shows how the numbers might work mathematically. So 300,000 base risk, is this something that we want to do about? Yeah, $300,000 annualized risk seems quite a lot to me. So yeah, I think we should do something about that. I have my adaptation action costs. So I got $1 million and $100,000. I can estimate my residual risks. If I spend $1 million, I'm going to reduce that down to my 300,000 down to 10,000. So that's a pretty good solution. I'm pretty much eliminating the risk here. If I spend my $100,000, I'm getting a residual risk of $50,000. So I've reduced the worst risks, but there are still some risks there. I can work out my risk benefit. So again, we're crunching through the mathematics. This is very inhuman process here. Hence the reason why you need to engage people. I can do my cost benefit calculation. I got an index here of 3.4, or I've got an index here of 0.4. So one simple way of thinking about this is payback. So if we think about this, this one's going to pay back in, let's say, 3.5 years. This one's going to pay back in less than half a year. I know this isn't real economics. It is a tool to help us make decisions. Option 2, clearly very affordable, but we need to ask ourselves, is the residual risk acceptable? Option 1, much lower residual risk, but can we afford it? The cost benefit ratio of option 2 is much better. In option 1, it would appear to pay back in less than a year. Note that in the big scheme of things, both options appear to be good options. Both pay back in less than 4 years. If you think about doing something on your house, let's say you wanted to install solar panels, you might have a personal threshold saying, yeah, do you know what? If I want to spend $15,000 sticking something on the roof of my house, I want to get a payback in 5 years. I'd see that as being a pretty good deal. If you're not going to get a payback in 20 years or 25 years, you might think, do you know what? I'm going to think twice about installing solar panels. I'm going to come up with other ways of saving energy in my home. So this idea around payback helps us to understand intuitively, is this a good thing to do or not? So I've got a comment here. This is pseudo economics. It's a tool to help us make decisions. But it is useful. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to move on to monitoring treatment monitoring, and it's a little bit more than that. It's about monitoring risks and risk treatments. And we mentioned earlier on around using a risk register to help monitor risks. So here in the risk register, we can capture what the baseline risks are. You know, if this is the hazards, these are the causes, these are the vulnerabilities, I've assessed the likelihood, I've assessed the consequence, and if we weren't doing anything, this is what the risk would be. But we are doing stuff. We do have control measures in place. We've got those floodgates out there. We go check them on a monthly basis. We're doing our fire smarting around the community, where we do that every year, and we go and clear up all that brushwood. We've got a fire break that we maintain every year. These are all the control measures. So with those control measures in place, this is what we think current risk is. Is the risk still too high that we need to do something about? You know, in this case here, it is, yes, we need to do something. So what are we going to do? What actions do we need to take? So this is fundamentally what the risk register is. I guess what you could do is also on here, but a red, amber, green are those risk actions actually being implemented. You could put like a little traffic light system. Are they done? Are they in progress? Are they not started? I think the other thing I want to just touch on very briefly is the control measures. We think those controls are in place, but unless we actually check them, we really have no idea. So monitoring risk and risk controls is critical. If the inherent risk is high, and we're assuming that with those controls in place, the current level of risk is low, then those controls better be working. When Fred says he goes out there and he does his fire smarting, is he actually going out there and doing the fire smarting? When we say that, yeah, we built that fire break, it's all good, we got a fire break. Does the fire break only cover 25% of the community, or does it only cover 50% of the community? Have we now developed outside of that fire break? Have we, maybe those control measures aren't effective? Maybe we had a plan for 100% coverage, but due to funding shortfalls, we've only been able to implement 50% of it. So this is where we go. It's important to monitor the risk, monitor the completion of actions, monitor the effectiveness of controls, monitor and track risk events. So we said that these risks that these risks could happen. Have they happened? Have we actually seen any of these? And then we can begin to update our projections. And monitoring is also reviewing the effectiveness of the overall risk framework. Is our risk register being updated regularly enough? Is it giving us the right information? Are we communicating the actions that are in here to management, to other stakeholders, whether it be provincial, federal stakeholders? Are we communicating it to the public? If we come up with an action here to say we need to go and talk to the public to make them aware and make them do get them to help do their piece, have we actually done that? So we're going to do another quick case study here, and then we are in the we are getting close to the end here. So we've got this forest river property flooding. So it's community. You might be less worried. Think about flooding again. You might be less worried about property damage because you have floodgates and you put them up when the gauging station indicates a high level, and that is always accurate. Hold on, let me get this straight here. I got notes in one place and notes in another place. So we've got a risk register for a community, and this is a very, very simplified risk register. Fundamentally the same thing. This is what it's showing. There is property flooding. So we know that there could be property flooding. We've identified that as a risk. It's a high risk. Don't know what the number is, it's just a high risk. We know we have some controls in gates in place. So we have some floodgates that are further upstream. They're manual. We've got a gauging station that provides us with 4-hour warning that if there is flooding above the floodgates, then we could actually call people and create evacuation. We think that our controlled risk is low. So what would you want to check? So again, I think this is another one to do in the chat window. Just put in a few ideas in the chat window here. What are some of the things that you might check?
Got a few coming in. Conduct regular maintenance, making sure that the gauging station has duplicity in case of failure or improper calibration.
Yeah. So these are good ones.
Oh, Jeremy's got a good one. Making sure that 4 hours is enough warning time.
Yeah.
Checking back on that, yeah.
So you might do an exercise. You have a 4-hour warning time. You actually exercise that 4-hour warning time, and is it enough? And so this comes into, when you do emergency planning, do you exercise those emergency plans? Who acts on the warning? So have you put in roles and responsibilities? Yeah, for sure, we've got a 4-hour warning time. But if Fred doesn't know that he needs to tell Joe that, hey guys, the gauging station is flooded, we need to get out of here. If nobody knows that that's their responsibility, it doesn't matter how long your warning time is. It's regular maintenance of the floodgates. So immediately you're into risk managing. You are all risk managing now. Have we checked it? Do we know people are responsible? Is there a procedure? Is it communicated? Who's along the river? Maybe there's now people that are upstream of the floodgates, and they're going to be impacted. Are your climate projections even up to date? When was the last time you did this risk assessment? Was it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and it used 1999 climate data? Because it will be different today. So these are all great suggestions. They are all part of that process of managing risk. And then for sure, doing that forecasting, Pippa's a good one there, doing that forecasting, you might have expressed that risk today, but actually have you applied those climate projections and you've thought about what that risk might look like in the future? And if that is the future risk, how is that influencing your planning? how is that influencing, maybe you need to go and change the floodgates, and with planning permissions and everything else, that's going to take 5-10 years to implement. So fantastic suggestions. Appreciate that input. Thanks, guys. So last slide here, key takeaways. Risk management is really about taking action. The principles of risk management encourage us to think broadly and holistically. ISO 31000, which we've just stepped through, provides a tried and tested process to risk management. When we treat risks, we should also consider no build options. If you ask an engineer about adaptation options, we will almost always come up with, we need to build something. That's not universally true, and I apologize to engineers, but we just need to be cautious that we're considering other perspectives to other different types of solutions. Evaluating options on cost benefit is a useful way to help us make decisions, adaptation decisions, and that can be applied on build solutions or no build solutions. And we should always circle back and check what has changed and if things work. So thanks for listening. We can begin to open up some of the questions here.
Awesome. So before we get to the questions, we're going to do our final mentee poll of the day. So same code, same site, and similar to our question from yesterday, we'd like to know what the most interesting concept that you learned about in Owen's session is today.